Case 1. Am I Bishop? A routine faculty meeting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville was 40 minutes old when Amy Bishop stood up, pulled a 9mm Ruger handgun from her bag, and began executing her colleagues. The date was February 12, 2010. The location was room 369 of the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. 12 biology professors sat around a conference table discussing departmental business. Bishop had sat quietly through the meeting, offering no indication of what was about to happen. Then she rose, drew the weapon, and fired methodically down the table. 3 professors died. 3 others were critically wounded. Bishop stepped into the hallway, walked to a restroom, dropped the gun into a trash can, and sat down as though nothing had occurred. Campus police arrived within minutes and placed her under arrest. She looked at them and said, "It wasn't me." Amy Joy Bishop was born on April 24, 1965, in Iowa City, Iowa. She earned a PhD in genetics from Harvard University and built a career as a research scientist. She was 45 years old in 2010, married to James Anderson, and the mother of 4 children. Her position as assistant professor of biological sciences at the University of Alabama in Huntsville represented the culmination of years of academic training. She had authored multiple scientific papers. She had invented a portable cell incubator. Students and colleagues described her as brilliant, erratic, and confrontational. Beneath the professional accomplishments lay a history of violence that had been ignored or excused for decades. In 1986, when Bishop was 21 years old, she shot and killed her 18-year-old brother Seth at their family home in Massachusetts. Authorities ruled the death an accident. 2 decades later, after the University of Alabama shooting, investigators reopened the case and determined that Bishop had intentionally murdered her brother and that local police had covered up the homicide. In 1993, Bishop was arrested for sending a pipe bomb to a Harvard professor who had supervised her postdoctoral work. No charges were filed. In 2002, she was arrested for assault at an IHOP restaurant after punching a woman in the head during an argument over a booster seat. Bishop was diagnosed with paranoia and extreme narcissism, though she was deemed legally competent. The University of Alabama had denied her tenure in early 2010, which meant her employment would be terminated. For a woman who had invested her entire adult life in academia, the denial was unbearable. The 3 colleagues Amy Bishop killed on February 12, 2010, were accomplished scientists with families and promising futures. Dr. Gopi Padilla, 52 years old, served as chairman of the biology department. Dr. Maria Ragland Davis was 50 years old. Dr. Adriel Johnson was 52 years old. All 3 held PhDs in biology. All 3 were married with children. Students regarded them as mentors. The university community respected them as dedicated researchers. Their careers were flourishing. They sat in a small conference room with no escape route, trapped in a meeting with a woman who believed they had destroyed her career. Bishop had practiced at a local shooting range in the weeks before the attack, familiarizing herself with the 9mm Ruger handgun she had borrowed from her husband. On the morning of February 12th, she concealed the weapon in a tote bag and brought it to campus. She attended the faculty meeting as scheduled and waited. After 40 minutes, she stood, drew the gun, and fired. The shots were deliberate. She aimed for the head. Dr. Padilla, Dr. Davis, and Dr. Johnson died within moments. 3 other faculty members survived with critical injuries. Bishop stopped firing, left the room, walked to a restroom, disposed of the gun, and sat in the hallway. She appeared calm. When campus police arrived and arrested her, she denied responsibility. Surviving faculty members identified Bishop as the shooter immediately. Police recovered the 9mm Ruger from the restroom trash can. Gunshot residue was found on Bishop's hands and clothing. Ballistics testing matched the weapon to shell casings at the scene. Surveillance cameras captured Bishop leaving the conference room moments after the shooting. The physical evidence left no room for doubt. As investigators examined Bishop's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. The 2002 IHOP assault, the 1993 pipe bomb, the 1986 shooting death of her brother. Students had filed petitions complaining about Bishop's aggressive classroom behavior. The university had done nothing. Massachusetts authorities reopened the investigation into Seth Bishop's death after the faculty meeting massacre and determined that Amy had intentionally killed him. She was retroactively indicted for his murder. Bishop was charged with 1 count of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Prosecutors initially sought the death penalty. Her defense attorneys raised mental health issues, citing her diagnoses of paranoia and narcissism. Psychiatric evaluations delayed the proceedings for more than 2 years. Madison County District Attorney Robert Broussard built a case around the physical evidence and clear premeditation. Defense attorney Roy Miller attempted to argue that Bishop's mental illness had prevented her from forming intent. The argument failed. On September 11, 2012, Bishop changed her plea to guilty, avoiding trial and execution. Judge Alan Mann sentenced Amy Bishop on September 24, 2012, to life in prison without parole, plus 3 consecutive life sentences for the attempted murders. Families of the victims spoke of the devastating loss to the University of Alabama scientific community. Bishop offered a rambling apology, claiming she had not been herself on the day of the shooting. Years later, she attempted to withdraw her guilty plea, arguing that her attorneys had failed to adequately explore her mental illness. The motion was denied. Amy Bishop, now 61 years old, remains incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. Parole is not a possibility. The University of Alabama shooting prompted security reforms on college campuses nationwide and led to stricter background checks for academic hiring. Scholarships and memorial gardens honor Dr. Gopi Padilla, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson. 3 brilliant scientists were killed by a colleague who had exhibited warning signs for decades. Those signs had been ignored. The cost was measured in 3 stolen lives, 3 destroyed families, and a university community forced to reckon with what might have been prevented. Case 2. Wyndham Lathem. 2 men connected through an online suicide chat room in 2017 and discovered they shared a dark fantasy. One was a renowned infectious disease researcher and associate professor of microbiology at Northwestern University. The other was a financial officer at Oxford University in England. Their shared obsession was simple and depraved. They would murder someone together, then commit suicide as a final act of twisted intimacy. On July 27, 2017, they carried out the first half of their plan in a luxury apartment in Chicago's River North neighborhood. The victim was Trenton Cornell Duran-Lowe, a 26-year-old hairstylist who was the Northwestern professor's boyfriend. He was stabbed more than 70 times with a drywall saw and kitchen knives while he slept. The attackers showered, rented a car, made a $1,000 donation in the victim's name to a local health center, and fled. An 8-day national manhunt ended with both men in custody. The suicide pact was never completed. Only the murder was. Wyndham Lathem was born in 1974 and raised in an environment that valued education and achievement. He earned a PhD in microbiology and built a career studying some of the world's most dangerous pathogens. At 42 years old in 2017, Lathem held the position of Associate Professor of Microbiology Immunology at Northwestern University in Chicago. His research focused on the bubonic plague. He possessed high-level security clearances due to the sensitive nature of his work. Peers regarded him as one of the brightest minds in infectious disease research. He was globally respected, highly paid, and had no criminal record. Professionally, he appeared to be a man wholly dedicated to science. Privately, Lathem harbored deeply suppressed suicidal ideations and dark sexual fantasies. In online chat rooms dedicated to discussions of suicide and violence, he found others who shared his obsessions. Andrew Warren, a 56-year-old financial officer at Oxford University, was one of them. Trenton Cornell Duranlow was 26 years old when he died. He worked as a hairstylist in Chicago and was known among friends and family as kind, talented, and full of life. He had recently moved to the city to pursue his career and had become a beloved figure in the local LGBTQ+ community. He was close to his parents and siblings. He had built a circle of friends who admired his warmth and creativity. Trenton was dating Wyndham Lathem. On the night of July 26, 2017, he went to sleep in Lathem's apartment at 500 North State Street. He had no idea that Lathem had flown a man from England to Chicago for the explicit purpose of killing him. Chat logs between Lathem and Warren detailed the plan in explicit terms. The two men shared a mutual fantasy: kill someone, then commit suicide together in a final act of intimacy and destruction. Lathem paid for Warren's flight from England to Chicago. On the morning of July 27, 2017, the two men attacked Trenton while he slept. They stabbed him more than 70 times with a drywall saw and kitchen knives. The assault was frenzied and sustained. Trenton's body was found later with injuries so severe that he had been nearly decapitated. After the killing, Lathem and Warren showered, changed clothes, and left the apartment. They rented a car and made a $1,000 donation to a health center in Trenton's name, a grotesque gesture that investigators later described as an attempt to ease guilt or create the appearance of remorse. Hours after the murder, Lathem placed an anonymous call to the front desk of his apartment building, alerting staff that something terrible had happened. Police responded and found Trenton's body. The crime scene was horrific. Blood-covered floors and walls. Murder weapons had been left behind. An 8-day national manhunt was launched. Investigators identified Lathem and Warren as suspects and began tracking their movements. Police uncovered Lathem's disturbing online activity during the investigation. He had spent months in dark web suicide chat rooms, discussing fantasies with strangers, and eventually connecting with Warren. Chat logs between the two men were explicit. Every detail of the murder had been planned. The victim was not random. Trenton had been chosen because he was accessible and because Lathem wanted to eliminate the relationship. On August 4th, 2017, after a week on the run, Lathem and Warren surrendered to police in Oakland, California. The trial of Wyndham Lathem began in September 2021 in Cook County Criminal Court. Judge Charles Burns presided. Andrew Warren had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Warren testified that the murder had been Lathem's idea, that Lathem had paid for his flight, and that the two had planned the attack together. Chat logs introduced as evidence confirmed Warren's account. The messages detailed the murder plot, discussed methods of killing, and revealed the twisted sexual and suicidal fantasies that had motivated both men. Defense attorneys argued that Warren had acted alone, that Lathem had been in the bathroom during the attack, and that Warren had committed the murder in a drug-fueled rage. Physical evidence undermined the defense. Lathem's DNA was found throughout the crime scene, mixed with Trenton's blood. Chat logs showed that Lathem had been an active and willing participant in the planning. Lathem took the stand and wept during his testimony, claiming he had been manipulated by Warren. The jury found his performance unconvincing. In October 2021, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Judge Charles Burns sentenced Wyndham Lathem on January 18, 2022, to 53 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, the judge called the crime quote, _1, _Lathem. Showed no reaction. Trenton Cornell, Duranlow's family, spoke of the devastating loss of a young man whose life had been stolen for no reason other than the sick fantasy of two men who had met in an online chat room. The sentence required Lathem to serve 100% of his time. Andrew Warren, who had testified against Lathem, was sentenced separately and received a reduced sentence. Wyndham Lathem, now 51 years old, serves his sentence at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. His inmate number is Y45719. No possibility of parole exists. The case became a symbol of the dangers lurking in dark corners of the internet, where fantasies of violence and death can be shared, encouraged, and ultimately acted upon. Two elite academics from two of the world's most prestigious universities, Northwestern and Oxford, met in a suicide chat room and conspired to commit murder purely for the thrill. Trenton Cornell Duranlow was killed because he happened to be asleep in the bed of a man he trusted. The suicide pact that Lathem and Warren had fantasized about completing was abandoned. Only the murder remained. Case 3. Dr. Robert Ferrante. Dr. Autumn Klein collapsed at home in April 2013 after drinking what her husband told her was a fertility supplement. She was a 41-year-old neurologist and chief of women's neurology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Her husband, Dr. Robert Ferrante, a leading researcher in neurological surgery, had assured her that the drink would help her conceive another child. 3 days later, she was dead. The supplement was creatine-laced with potassium cyanide. Ferrante had ordered the poison using his university lab credentials just 2 days before administering it to his wife. He stood by her hospital bed playing the grieving husband while knowing exactly why she was dying. A suspicious doctor ordered a blood test that revealed lethal levels of cyanide in her system. 3 months later, Ferrante was arrested. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case became a textbook example of how professional authority can be weaponized to commit murder. Robert J. Ferrante was born around 1948 in Massachusetts. He earned a PhD and built a career as a neurological researcher. In 2013, at 64 years old, Ferrante worked as a leading professor and researcher in the Department of Neurological Surgery at the University of Pittsburgh. He was wealthy, earning a substantial university salary and managing significant grant funding for his research. He had been married previously and had older children from that marriage. In the early 2000s, he married Dr. Autumn Klein, a brilliant young neurologist who was 23 years his junior. The couple had one young daughter together. Colleagues and friends saw Ferrante as a dedicated scientist and devoted husband, but the marriage had begun to deteriorate. Autumn was allegedly contemplating leaving Ferrante. He was consumed with jealousy and suspicion that she was having an affair. The thought of losing her and losing control became unbearable. Dr. Autumn Klein served as chief of women's neurology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where she was known as a compassionate physician and a rising star in her field. She was vibrant, accomplished, and deeply invested in her work. She and Ferrante had been trying to have another child. Autumn had been open with friends about her desire to expand their family. She trusted her husband's medical expertise. Nothing in their relationship gave her reason to suspect that the man she had married would use that trust to kill her. On April 17, 2013, Ferrante gave Autumn a drink that he told her was a creatine supplement to boost her fertility. She drank it without hesitation. Within hours, she collapsed. Ferrante called 911, claiming his wife was having a stroke. Autumn was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to determine the cause of her sudden and catastrophic decline. She was placed on life support, but her condition continued to worsen. A doctor who had treated Autumn became suspicious. The symptoms did not match a stroke or any common medical emergency. The doctor ordered a specific blood test to check for poisons. The test revealed off-the-charts levels of cyanide in Autumn's system. The levels were lethal. On April 20th, 2013, Autumn Klein died. Investigators turned their attention to Robert Ferrante immediately. A search of his university lab records revealed that he had used his credentials to order a half-pound of potassium cyanide just 2 days before Autumn collapsed. The order had been placed through the university's procurement system. Because of Ferrante's esteemed position as a researcher, no one had questioned it. Detectives examined Ferrante's internet search history. In the hours before and after Autumn's collapse, Ferrante had Googled quote 2 and quote 3. The searches left no doubt about his intent. While Autumn lay dying in the hospital, Ferrante stood by her bedside, playing the role of the grieving husband. He made tearful statements to family and friends. He appeared devastated. The performance was convincing to everyone except the investigators building a case against him. On July the 25th, 2013, Robert Ferrante was arrested in West Virginia as he attempted to flee Pittsburgh. He was charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in October 2014 in Allegheny County Court. Judge Jeffrey A. Manning presided. The prosecution presented the lab records showing Ferrante's cyanide order, the internet search history, blood test results showing lethal cyanide levels, and testimony from the doctor who had ordered the test. The evidence was methodical and damning. The defense argued that Ferrante had ordered the cyanide for legitimate research purposes, and that Autumn's death had been a tragic accident or the result of suicide. The jury was not persuaded. On November 7th, 2014, Ferrante was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence for first-degree murder in Pennsylvania is mandatory life in prison without parole. Judge Manning imposed that sentence. Ferrante was remanded to the custody of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. During trial and sentencing, Autumn Klein's family spoke of the brilliant, compassionate woman who had been stolen from them by the man who had promised to love and protect her. Robert Ferrante, at 77 years old, remains imprisoned at SC Wishotsdale in Pennsylvania for the rest of his natural life. The cyanide he ordered using his university lab credentials, the Google searches he conducted while his wife lay dying, and the performance he gave at her hospital bedside all pointed to a man who believed his intelligence and status would allow him to commit the perfect crime. He was wrong. Autumn Klein's death led to increased scrutiny of how research institutions manage access to dangerous substances. Her family established a scholarship in her name to honor her contributions to medicine. Ferrante's name, once associated with groundbreaking neurological research, is now synonymous with betrayal and murder. Case 4. Dr. Dirk Grinder. A man was screaming near Morse's Pond in Wellesley, Massachusetts, on the morning of October 31st, 1999. He flagged down passers-by, claiming his wife had been attacked. When police arrived, they found the body of Mabel May Grinder, a 58-year-old registered nurse and community volunteer, lying in the woods. She had been bludgeoned with a hammer and stabbed in the neck. Her husband, Dr. Dirk Grinder, a wealthy allergist and clinical professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, claimed he had left her briefly to retrieve a back brace from their home and had returned to find her murdered by a random assailant. The story unraveled quickly. Police found a hammer and gloves in a nearby storm drain. DNA testing linked the gloves to Dirk. Investigators uncovered evidence of a massive secret life involving prostitutes and pornography that Dirk had been hiding for years. He had killed his wife to prevent her from discovering the truth and to avoid the financial and social devastation of a divorce. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole, where he remains today, still filing appeals. Dirk K. Grinder was born in the early 1940s and grew up to become one of the most respected allergists in Massachusetts. He earned both an MD and a PhD and built a career that spanned decades. At 58 years old in 1999, Dirk was a multimillionaire and clinical professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He and his wife, May, had been married for more than 30 years and were regarded as pillars of the Wellesley community. They lived in an affluent neighborhood, belonged to elite social circles, and presented the image of a perfect marriage. Dirk was known as a dedicated physician and devoted husband. Beneath the surface, he was living a double life. He frequented prostitutes, maintained extensive files of pornography on his computer, and spent significant amounts of money on sexual encounters that he kept hidden from his wife. Dirk feared that May was beginning to suspect the truth. If she filed for divorce, his reputation would be destroyed, his wealth would be divided, and his standing at Harvard would be jeopardized. He decided the solution was to kill her and stage the murder to look like a random attack. Mabel May Grinder was a registered nurse, a mother, and a beloved member of the Wellesley community. She and Dirk had raised children together and had built what appeared to be a stable, loving marriage. Friends described May as kind, generous, and devoted to her family. She had no idea her husband was living a secret life or planning to kill her. Dirk and May went for a walk with their dog at Morse's Pond on the morning of October 31st, 1999. Dirk later claimed he had left May alone for a few minutes to drive home and retrieve a back brace he had forgotten. When he returned, he said, he found her lying in the woods, brutally attacked. He flagged down passers-by and called for help. May was dead when police arrived. She had been bludgeoned with a hammer and stabbed in the neck. The attack had been vicious and sustained. Dirk appeared distraught. He told investigators that a random attacker must have killed his wife while he was gone. The story did not withstand scrutiny. Investigators began searching the area around Morse's Pond. In a storm drain near the crime scene, they found a hammer and a pair of gloves. Both items were covered in blood. The gloves were sent for DNA testing. The results came back with a match to Dirk Grinder. The evidence suggested that Dirk had attacked his wife, disposed of the murder weapons in the storm drain, and then staged the scene to look like a random assault. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered Dirk's secret life. His computer contained extensive files documenting his use of prostitutes and his obsession with pornography. The motive became clear. Dirk had killed May to prevent her from discovering the truth and to avoid the consequences of a divorce. Dirk Grinder was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in May 2001 in Norfolk County Superior Court. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence from the gloves, the hammer found in the storm drain, and the digital files that revealed Dirk's secret activities. The defense argued that the DNA evidence had been contaminated and that Dirk had been framed. The jury did not believe it. On June 29, 2001, Dirk Grinder was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence for first-degree murder in Massachusetts is mandatory life in prison without parole. Dirk was sentenced and sent to MCI Norfolk, a maximum security prison. In the years since his conviction, Dirk has filed numerous appeals, claiming the DNA evidence was mishandled and that he is innocent. Every appeal has been denied. The evidence against him has been upheld by multiple courts. Dirk Grinder, at 84 years old, continues to serve his life sentence at MCY Norfolk in Massachusetts. He files appeals claiming wrongful conviction. The irony is not lost on observers. An elite Harvard medical professor, a man who understood DNA and forensic science, was brought down by the very science he studied. May Grinder's family has never stopped grieving the loss of a woman who was killed by the man who had promised to love her. The case remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of secret lives and the lengths to which people will go to protect their reputations. Case 5. Dr. Richard Sharp, July 14, 2000. A Harvard Medical School dermatologist and multimillionaire, laser hair removal pioneer, dressed in women's clothing, drove to his estranged wife's home in Gloucester, Massachusetts, kicked down the door, and chased her through the house before shooting her with a .22 caliber rifle in front of witnesses. Dr. Richard Sharp was 46 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and consumed with rage over the impending divorce and his wife's demands for a share of his fortune. He committed the murder while wearing a blonde wig, women's makeup, and a dress, details that would dominate media coverage and turn the trial into a spectacle. He fled to New Hampshire, where he was arrested after a standoff with police. At trial, his defense team attempted to argue that the murder had been fueled by a combination of diet pills, alcohol, and mental illness related to his struggles with gender identity. The jury rejected the argument entirely. Sharp was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. In January 2009, while serving his sentence at MCY Shirley, he committed suicide in his prison cell by hanging. He was 54 years old. Richard L. Sharp was born in the 1950s and built a career as a dermatologist and entrepreneur. He earned an MD and became an assistant professor of dermatology at Harvard Medical School. He was also a pioneer in the field of laser hair removal, a business venture that made him a multimillionaire by the late 1990s. His practice was lucrative. His reputation in medical circles was strong. His personal life, however, was a disaster. Sharp had severe anger issues, a cross-dressing compulsion that he kept hidden from most people in his life, and what psychologists would later describe as narcissistic personality disorder. He had been married to Karen Sharp for years, and during that time, he had been abusive toward her. Karen endured the abuse for as long as she could before finally escaping his control. She filed for divorce in 2000 and began fighting for a fair financial settlement. Sharp was enraged by her demands. He could not tolerate the idea of losing his wealth or his carefully constructed reputation. The thought of Karen walking away with half of what he had built became an obsession. He decided that killing her was preferable to divorce. Karen Sharp was 44 years old when she died. She had endured years of abuse during her marriage to Richard and had finally found the courage to leave. She was fighting for a fair share of the assets they had accumulated during their marriage. She was beginning to build a new life free from his control. She had moved into a home where she felt safe, surrounded by family members who supported her. On the morning of July 14th, 2000, she was at that home when Richard kicked down the door. Sharp had dressed in women's clothing before driving to Karen's home. He wore a blonde wig, makeup, and a dress. The costume may have been part of a plan to disguise himself, or it may have been connected to his cross-dressing compulsion. When he arrived at the house, he forced his way inside and chased Karen through the rooms. Family members who were present witnessed the attack. Sharp shot Karen with a .22 caliber rifle, killing her in front of them. He then fled the scene, got into his car, and drove north. Police tracked him to New Hampshire, where he was eventually located and arrested after a tense standoff. He was extradited back to Massachusetts to face charges. The trial took place in November 2001. The prosecution presented the eyewitness testimony of the family members who had watched Sharp chase and shoot Karen. They presented evidence that Sharp had driven to Karen's home with the specific intent to kill her. The motive was clear. He wanted to avoid losing his fortune in a divorce settlement. The defense argued that Sharp had been driven to murder by a toxic combination of diet pills, alcohol, and the psychological distress caused by his struggles with gender identity. Defense attorneys attempted to paint Sharp as a man who had lost control of his faculties due to chemical imbalances and mental illness. The argument was undermined by the premeditated nature of the attack. Sharp had driven to Karen's home. He had broken in. He had chased her through the house before shooting her. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Richard Sharp was sent to M.C. Court Shirley, a maximum security prison in Massachusetts, to serve his sentence. He adapted to prison life, but never stopped protesting his conviction. On January 12, 2009, approximately 8 years after his sentencing, prison staff found Sharp dead in his cell. He had committed suicide by hanging himself. He was 54 years old at the time of his death. The method was consistent with other prison suicides, and no evidence of foul play was found. The case became a media spectacle because of the cross-dressing detail. News outlets focused on the blonde wig, the makeup, and the dress. Tabloids ran sensational headlines. But the core of the case was straightforward and tragic. A wealthy, abusive man killed his wife to avoid losing his fortune in a divorce. Karen Sharp's family was left to mourn a woman who had finally freed herself from years of abuse, only to be murdered by the man she had tried to escape. The costume Sharp wore on the day of the murder became a symbol of the case, but it was ultimately a distraction from the central truth. Richard Sharp killed Karen because he believed his wealth and reputation were more important than her life. He was wrong. Karen's death was not in vain. Her family pursued justice, and they saw him convicted. His suicide in prison ensured that he would never have the opportunity to appeal his conviction or to walk free. Karen Sharp is remembered by those who loved her as a woman who fought to escape an abusive marriage and who deserved the chance to live the life she had planned. Richard Sharp is remembered as a Harvard professor who threw away his career, his freedom, and ultimately his life because he could not accept the consequences of divorce. Case 6. Rafael Robb, December 22, 2006. A tenured professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania bludgeoned his wife to death with a chin-up bar in their home in Upper Merion Township, Pennsylvania. Rafael Robb was an expert in game theory, the mathematical study of strategic decision-making. He would apply that expertise to his own criminal case. After killing his wife, Ellen, he staged the scene to look like a botched burglary and then returned to wrapping Christmas presents as though nothing had happened. When police arrived, he played the role of the shocked and grieving husband with convincing precision. But the evidence did not support the burglary theory, and investigators quickly identified Robb as the prime suspect. Rather than face a jury trial with a high probability of conviction for first-degree murder, Robb calculated his odds and accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a sentence of 5 to 10 years in prison, avoiding a first-degree murder conviction that would have carried life without parole. He was released on parole in 2017 after serving less than 11 years. The case became infamous as an example of how a brilliant academic used his expertise in risk analysis to game the criminal justice system treating his wife's murder as nothing more than a strategic calculation. Rafael Robb was born around 1950 and earned a PhD in economics. At 56 years old in 2006, he held a tenured professorship at the University of Pennsylvania, where he specialized in game theory. His work focused on analyzing strategic interactions and calculating optimal outcomes in competitive scenarios. He was highly respected in academic circles and earned a substantial salary and pension. Robb was married to Ellen Robb, and the couple had one daughter. The marriage had fallen apart. Ellen was actively packing to leave him and had hired a divorce attorney. Robb knew that a divorce would mean losing half of his pension and assets. He calculated that killing Ellen was a more favorable outcome than losing his wealth. Ellen Robb had endured a difficult marriage and had finally made the decision to leave. She was packing her belongings and preparing for a new life. She had hired legal representation and was moving forward with divorce proceedings. She was 49 years old and looking forward to freedom. She had no idea that her husband was planning to kill her rather than allow the divorce to proceed. Robb attacked Ellen in their home and bludgeoned her to death with a chin-up bar. The assault was sustained and brutal. After killing her, Robb set about staging the scene. He scattered items around the house to make it appear that a burglar had ransacked the home. He broke a window. He moved furniture. Then he returned to wrapping Christmas presents, establishing the appearance of a normal domestic scene interrupted by a home invasion. When he called 911 to report his wife's death, he claimed that he had come home to find her murdered. The performance was calculated and cold. He expressed shock. He appeared distraught. The act was designed to deflect suspicion. Investigators did not believe Robb's story. The staged burglary was unconvincing from the start. There were no signs of forced entry that made sense given the supposed scenario. Items that a burglar would have taken were still in the home. Nothing of significant value had been stolen. The focus shifted to Robb almost immediately. Detectives began building a case against him, examining his behavior on the day of the murder and in the days that followed. Robb, using his expertise in game theory, began analyzing the situation from a strategic standpoint. He calculated that his chances of being convicted of first-degree murder at trial were high, which would result in a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. He also calculated that if he accepted a plea deal for voluntary manslaughter, he could receive a much shorter sentence and potentially be released while still relatively young. Robb decided that the plea was the statistically superior choice. The risk of a life sentence was too high. The certainty of a reduced sentence was preferable. In 2008, Rafael Robb pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. The plea deal was accepted by prosecutors, who calculated that securing a guaranteed conviction was preferable to the risk of losing at trial. On January 28, 2008, Robb was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. The sentence was shockingly lenient for a man who had brutally killed his wife. Ellen Robb's family was devastated by the outcome. They had hoped for a first-degree murder conviction and a life sentence. Instead, they watched as Robb received what amounted to a slap on the wrist. Robb was released on parole in 2017 after serving less than 11 years. Ellen Robb's family pursued justice through other means. In 2018, they won a $124 million civil wrongful death lawsuit against Robb, though collecting the judgment proved difficult. Rafael Robb currently lives as a free man following his 2017 release from prison. The case remains one of the most controversial in Pennsylvania legal history. A tenured Ivy League economics professor specializing in game theory calculated that killing his wife and accepting a plea deal was statistically better for his personal freedom than losing half his pension in a divorce. Ellen Robb's daughter lost her mother to murder and watched as her father served a fraction of the time that many believed he deserved. the chin-up bar used to kill Ellen, the staged burglary scene, and the plea deal negotiated by a man who specialized in calculating optimal outcomes all pointed to a cold, rational mind that treated murder as a problem to be solved through strategic analysis. Ellen Robb deserved better. Her family deserved better. The justice system failed them both. Rafael Robb walked free in 2017, having successfully gamed the system he had studied for decades. The $124 million civil judgment stands as a symbolic acknowledgement of the injustice, but it cannot bring Ellen back or erase the fact that her killer calculated that her life was worth less than his pension. Case 7. Raymond Clark III, September 8th, 2009. A 24-year-old doctoral student at Yale University walked into a research building on the New Haven campus and never walked out alive. Annie Lee was 5 days away from her wedding. On September 13th, the day she was to be married, police found her body stuffed inside a wall cavity in the basement of the laboratory building where she conducted her research. She had been strangled to death. Her jaw and collarbone were broken. The man who killed her was Raymond Clark III, a 24-year-old animal research technician who worked in the same building. Clark had sent emails complaining about dirty mouse cages she had allegedly left behind. The workplace dispute escalated. On the morning of September 8th, Clark attacked Lou in the lab, strangled her, and hid her body in a wall. He changed his clothes, signed out of the building, and went home. 4 days later, while police searched frantically for Annie, her body was discovered on what should have been her wedding day. Clark was arrested, pleaded guilty to murder and attempted sexual assault, and was sentenced to 44 years in prison. Raymond J. Clark III was born in the mid-1980s and grew up in Branford, Connecticut. He did not attend Yale University as a student. In 2004, shortly after graduating from high school, his sister helped him secure a job as an animal services technician in Yale's pharmacology lab. The job required prior experience working with animals, which Clark did not have. He lied on the application, falsely claiming he had worked on a farm. He was hired anyway. The position was a good one by local standards, and Clark took it seriously. He was promoted to lab technician, a role that put him in contact with researchers and graduate students. His job involved cleaning animal cages, maintaining lab equipment, and enforcing protocols for the treatment of research animals. Lab technicians were responsible for ensuring that researchers followed the rules. If anything went wrong, the technicians were held accountable. The job was high stress. Clark was known among students and faculty as a control freak who clashed with scientists over lab protocols. He was particular, rigid, and confrontational. At 24 years old in 2009, he had been working at Yale for 5 years. He was engaged to be married and living with his fiancée, who also worked as a Yale lab technician. Annie Lee was born in San Jose, California, in 1985, and raised in a large, tight-knit Vietnamese-American family. She was a brilliant student who excelled in high school and college. She attended the University of Rochester, where she met and fell in love with Jonathan Wadowski, a fellow student. After graduation, Annie enrolled in Yale's doctoral program in pharmacology. Her research focused on studying the effects of medicines on mice, work that had implications for treatments for cancer, diabetes, and muscular dystrophy. She was 5 days away from marrying Jonathan when she disappeared. Ironically, months before her death, Annie had written an article for Yale Medical Schools magazine titled Crime and Safety in New Haven. She was an optimistic, accomplished young woman with a future that seemed limitless. Security cameras captured Annie entering the lab building at 10 Amistad Street at 10 a.m. on September 8th, 2009. She never left. At some point during the day, Raymond Clark attacked her. He strangled her to death. The medical examiner later determined that she had died from traumatic asphyxiation due to neck compression. Her jaw and collarbone were broken during the assault. Clark's DNA was found all over the crime scene, including in her underwear. After killing Annie, Clark hid her body in a crawl space inside a wall cavity in the basement of the building. He changed his clothes, signed out of the building using a green pen, and left. Surveillance footage showed him exiting the building and changing his clothes during the day. When investigators later questioned him, Clark had scratches on his face and left arm. He claimed the scratches had come from a cat. When Annie did not return home that night, one of her roommates reported her missing. Her pocketbook and cell phone were found in the lab, but there was no sign of Annie. The FBI joined the search. For 5 days, investigators combed through the building and the surrounding area. On September 13, 2009, the day Annie was supposed to marry Jonathan Wadowski, police found her body inside the wall. The discovery was devastating. New Haven Police Chief James Lewis held a press conference and characterized the case as workplace violence, a growing concern across the country. Investigators focused on Raymond Clark almost immediately. He was the only person named publicly as a person of interest. Police obtained search warrants to collect DNA samples from Clark and searched his apartment in Middletown, Connecticut. The DNA results came back as a match to evidence found at the crime scene. On September 17, 2009, Clark was arrested and charged with murder and felony murder. He was held on $3 million bail. Clark initially pleaded not guilty in January 2010. Pretrial proceedings dragged on for more than a year. In March 2011, Clark changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to murder and entered an Alford plea to 1 count of attempted sexual assault, meaning he did not admit to the assault, but conceded that the state had enough evidence to convict him. The plea deal allowed Clark to avoid a trial and a potential sentence of 60 years. In exchange, he agreed to a sentence of 44 years for murder and 20 years for sexual assault to be served concurrently. On June 3, 2011, Clark was formally sentenced in New Haven Superior Court. Annie Le's mother, Vivian Le, spoke at the hearing. "I will never hug Annie again," she said. "The world will never know what she had to offer. I will never see her walking down the aisle." Clark apologized to the family, stating that he alone was responsible for Annie's death and that he had caused tremendous pain to everyone who loved her. Judge Charles Burns called the crime horrific and depraved. Clark was sent to prison to begin serving his sentence. Raymond Clark III, at 40 years old, serves his sentence at Cheshire Correctional Institution in Connecticut. His scheduled release date is September 16, 2053, at which time he will be nearly 70 years old. Under a 2023 Connecticut law expanding parole eligibility for youthful offenders, Clark will become eligible for parole after serving 60% of his sentence, or approximately 26 years. Annie Le was 5 days away from her wedding. Her fiancé, Jonathan Wadowski, lost the woman he had planned to spend his life with. Her family lost a daughter whose brilliance and kindness had defined her life. The case prompted Yale to implement sweeping security reforms in its research facilities. But no policy change can bring Annie back. She was killed by a man who worked in the same building, a man who believed that a dispute over mouse cages justified murder. Case 8. Theodore Kaczynski. From 1978 to 1995. A series of untraceable mail bombs killed 3 people and injured 23 others across the United States. The bombs were sent to universities, airlines, and technology companies. The person responsible remained unidentified for nearly 2 decades. The FBI called the unknown suspect the Unabomber, a combination of, quote, 10 and, quote, 11 targets. In 1995, the bomber sent a 35,000-word manifesto to major newspapers, demanding that it be published in exchange for an end to the violence. The manifesto outlined an extreme anti-technology ideology and argued that modern industrial society was destroying human freedom. A man named David Kaczynski read the manifesto and recognized the writing style. The author was his brother, Theodore Kaczynski, a former mathematics professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who had abandoned academia in 1969 and spent the next 25 years living in a remote cabin in Montana. Theodore Kaczynski was arrested in 1996, pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, and was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without parole. He died in federal prison in June 2023. Theodore John Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was a child prodigy who excelled in mathematics from an early age. He skipped 2 grades and enrolled at Harvard University at the age of 16. At Harvard, he was subjected to psychological experiments conducted by Professor Henry Murray, experiments that some later theorized may have contributed to his growing anger and alienation. Kaczynski earned a bachelor's degree from Harvard and went on to complete a PhD in mathematics at the University of Michigan, where his dissertation on boundary functions was considered groundbreaking. At 25 years old, in 1967, he became an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley. He was regarded as a brilliant academic with a promising future, but Kaczynski was deeply unhappy. He hated modern society, despised technology, and believed that industrialization was destroying human autonomy. In 1969, after just 2 years of teaching, he resigned from Berkeley without explanation and disappeared into the wilderness. Kaczynski moved to a remote area outside Lincoln, Montana, where he built a small cabin and lived completely off the grid. He had no electricity, no running water, and no contact with the outside world. He spent his days reading, writing, and constructing bombs. His targets were chosen to represent what he saw as the evils of modern technology: universities that promoted technological advancement, airlines that symbolized industrialization, and corporations that profited from technology. The bombs were painstakingly constructed from scrap wood and untraceable materials. Each one was designed to maim or kill. The victims of Theodore Kaczynski's bombing campaign were people who had committed no crime other than working in fields that Kaczynski despised. Hugh Scruton, a 38-year-old computer store owner, was killed in Sacramento, California, in 1985 when he picked up a bomb disguised as a piece of scrap wood left in the parking lot behind his store. Thomas Mosser, a 50-year-old advertising executive, was killed in North Caldwell, New Jersey, in 1994 when he opened a package bomb at his home. Gilbert Murray, a 47-year-old timber industry lobbyist, was killed in Sacramento in 1995 when he opened a package bomb at his office. The bombs also injured 23 other people, some of whom suffered permanent disabilities. The campaign terrorized the nation for 17 years. In 1995, Kaczynski sent his manifesto, titled ___, quote, _12, ___, to the New York Times and the Washington Post. He promised to stop the bombings if the manifesto was published. The FBI and the Attorney General's office urged the newspapers to comply, hoping that publication might lead to the identification of the bomber. The manifesto was published in September 1995. David Kaczynski, who had not seen his brother in years, read the manifesto and was struck by the similarity between the writing style and the letters Ted had sent him over the years. After agonizing over the decision, David contacted the FBI. On April 3, 1996, federal agents raided Theodore Kaczynski's cabin in Montana. Inside, They found bomb-making materials, journals detailing the bombings, and drafts of the manifesto. Kaczynski was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and the use of explosives. He was held without bail. Kaczynski's trial was scheduled to begin in 1998. His defense attorneys wanted to argue that he was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but Kaczynski refused to cooperate with that strategy. He insisted that he was sane and that his actions were politically motivated. To avoid a trial and the possibility of execution, Kaczynski agreed to plead guilty. On January 22, 1998, he pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without parole. Kaczynski was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences. He was sent to ADX Florence, a supermax federal prison in Colorado, and later transferred to FMC Butner, a federal medical center in North Carolina. He spent the remainder of his life in prison, where he continued to write and correspond with supporters of his anti-technology ideology. On June 10, 2023, Theodore Kaczynski was found dead in his cell at FMC Butner. He had committed suicide. He was 81 years old. The Unabomber case remains one of the most infamous in American history. A genuine mathematical prodigy, a former Harvard undergraduate and Berkeley professor, weaponized his intellect against the very institutions that had nurtured him. His victims were people who represented progress and innovation. His legacy is one of terror, destruction, and wasted brilliance. Case 9, Dr. Thomas Murray, November 13, 2003. A 40-year-old attorney and conflict mediator named Carmen Ross was found dead in her rural home outside Lawrence, Kansas. She had been beaten and stabbed 13 times in the neck and back. The crime scene was violent and intensely personal. Ross had been engaged to be married and was planning to move to California with her daughter. That move was at the center of a bitter custody dispute with her ex-husband, Dr. Thomas Murray, a professor of English and linguistics at Kansas State University. Murray had been fighting to prevent Ross from taking their daughter out of state. The tension between them had escalated in the days before her death. 2 days before the murder, Murray and Ross had attended a mediation session that ended badly. The morning of November 13th, Murray dropped his daughter off early at a babysitter, drove to Ross's home, and killed her. He then established a false alibi and returned to his normal routine. Nearly a year later, investigators arrested Murray after discovering damning evidence on his computer. Internet searches for __quote_1 3 ____. The English professor who had meticulously researched the perfect crime was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Thomas Edward Murray was born in 1957. He earned a PhD in linguistics and built a career as a professor at Kansas State University, where he taught English and linguistics courses and published scholarly work. At 46 years old in 2003, he was divorced from Carmen Ross. The two shared custody of their daughter. The arrangement had been relatively stable until Ross announced that she was engaged to be married and planned to move to California. Murray was enraged. He could not tolerate the idea of losing custody or having his daughter moved across the country. The impending move became an obsession. Murray began researching how to eliminate the problem. Carmen D. Ross worked as an attorney and conflict mediator in the Lawrence, Kansas area, where she was well regarded as an advocate for peace and resolution. She was engaged to be married and planning to start a new chapter of her life in California with her fiancé and her daughter. Ross had endured a difficult relationship with Murray, but she had built a successful career and was looking forward to the future. On November 11th, 2003, she and Murray attended a mediation session to discuss custody arrangements. The session was tense and ended without resolution. 2 days later, she was dead. between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. on November 13, 2003, Thomas Murray drove to Carmen Ross's home at 1860 East 1150 Road in rural Lawrence, Kansas. He attacked her, beating her, and then stabbing her 13 times in the neck and back. The violence was sustained and personal. After killing her, Murray left the scene and established a false alibi. He returned to his normal routine as though nothing had happened. Ross's body was discovered later that day when her fiancé requested a welfare check after being unable to reach her. The investigation moved slowly at first. There were no witnesses to the murder, and Murray appeared to have an alibi. But investigators noticed cuts and bruises on Murray's hands and arms when they interviewed him shortly after the crime. They also found evidence that Murray had dropped his daughter off at a babysitter unusually early on the morning of November 13th, giving him time to drive to Ross's home and return before anyone noticed he was gone. The breakthrough came when detectives obtained a warrant to search Murray's computer. On the hard drive, they found internet searches that had been conducted in the weeks before the murder. The searches included how to murder someone and not get caught, how to commit the perfect murder, and other phrases related to evading detection after a homicide. The searches were explicit and damning. Murray, an English professor who prided himself on his intellect, had used the internet to research how to kill his ex-wife and avoid prosecution. The digital trail became the centerpiece of the case against him. Murray was arrested in October 2004, nearly a year after Carmen Ross's death. He was charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in February 2005 in Douglas County, Kansas. Prosecutor Sonia Balesti presented the timeline of Murray's movements on the morning of November 13th, the physical evidence of cuts and bruises on his body, and the internet search history from his computer. The searches were devastating. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Murray had been researching murder for academic or literary purposes, not because he intended to commit the crime. The jury did not believe it. The internet searches, combined with the timeline and the physical evidence, pointed clearly to Murray's guilt. Thomas Murray was found guilty of first-degree murder. Murray was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Under Kansas sentencing laws, he would be required to serve a minimum of 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. He was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas to begin serving his sentence. Thomas Murray, at 69 years old, serves his sentence at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. His earliest possible parole eligibility date is October 2029, at which time he will have served approximately 25 years. Carmen Ross was killed by the man she had once trusted enough to marry and have a child with. Her fiancé lost the woman he planned to spend his life with. Her daughter lost her mother to a murder committed by her own father. The irony of Murray's case is inescapable. An English professor who spent his career analyzing language and text used the internet to research how to murder someone and not get caught. And those very searches became the primary evidence that sent him to prison for life. Case 10, Charles Albright. From December 1990 to March 1991, the bodies of 3 women were found in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of South Dallas, Texas. All 3 were sex workers. All 3 had been shot in the head. All 3 had been found with their eyes surgically removed from their sockets with stunning precision. The brutality and the signature mutilation terrified the community and baffled investigators. The man eventually arrested and convicted of one of the murders was Charles Albright, a 57-year-old former science instructor who had worked at Dallas area community colleges. Albright had an obsession with eyes that dated back to his early years, when his overbearing adoptive mother had forbidden him from using glass eyes in his taxidermy projects and forced him to use buttons instead. Psychologists later theorized that this deprivation had contributed to his pathology. Charles Frederick Albright was born on August 10, 1933, in Amarillo, Texas. He was adopted from an orphanage by Dell and Fred Albright. Dell was a schoolteacher, and Fred was a Dallas grocer. Dell was strict, overprotective, and obsessive. She controlled every aspect of his life, and when Charles became interested in taxidermy, she encouraged him but could not afford to buy the glass eyes used by professional taxidermists, making him use buttons instead. As an adult, Albright lied frequently about his education and employment. He claimed at various times to have been a high school biology teacher and a football coach, though these claims were disputed. He was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and assault. During the late 1980s, Albright lived in Dallas with a woman named Dixie, who supported him financially. He worked delivering newspapers in the early morning hours, a job that gave him access to the streets where sex workers operated. The first victim attributed to Albright was Mary Lou Pratt, a 33-year-old sex worker found dead on December 13, 1990, in South Dallas. She had been shot in the back of the head with a .44 Magnum. When the medical examiner autopsied her body, a horrifying discovery was made. Her eyes had been surgically removed from their sockets with precision. The second victim was Susan Beth Peterson, a 27-year-old sex worker found on February 10, 1991, on the same street where Mary Pratt had been discovered. She had been shot 3 times, in the top of her head, in her left breast, and in the back of her head. Her eyes had also been removed. The third victim was Shirley Williams, found on March 18, 1991. She had been shot and her eyes had been removed. The media dubbed the killer the Dallas Ripper and the Eyeball Killer. Law enforcement increased patrols in the area, but the killings created widespread fear. Investigators focused on Charles Albright after receiving tips from people who knew him, and police searched his residence 6 times. Inside, they found an alarming collection: woodworking tools, X-Acto blades, dozens of true crime books, a copy of Gray's Anatomy, hundreds of close-up photographs of women's eyes, dolls, mannequins, face masks, and newspaper clippings of the 3 murders. Behind the fireplace mantel, police found a hidden compartment filled with rifles and pistols, though none matched the murder weapon. In a rented storage unit, they found jars of animal parts and dozens of taxidermy animals. Police also found X-Acto blades similar to a broken blade that had been left in Shirley Williams' skull. Hair fibers found at the crime scene were compared to samples from Albright. A forensic expert testified that the hairs matched, and it was on this hair evidence that the prosecution built its case. Charles Albright was arrested on March 22, 1991, and charged with the murders of Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Peterson, and Shirley Williams. He was held on $3 million bail, and the trial began in December 1991. The prosecution, led by Dallas County Assistant District Attorney Toby Shook, relied heavily on the hair evidence and the circumstantial evidence found in Albright's home. The defense argued that the evidence was insufficient and that Albright had been framed. During the trial, key pieces of evidence were mishandled or lost. Despite these issues, the jury convicted Charles Albright of murdering Shirley Williams on December 18, 1991, after 1 day of deliberation. He was acquitted of killing another woman because he had an alibi, and charges for the murders of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Charles Albright was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Years later, DNA testing was conducted on the hair evidence that had been central to Albright's conviction. The results showed that the hairs were not human. They were from a dog. Despite this revelation, Albright's conviction was not overturned. Albright spent his final years at the John Montford Psychiatric Unit in Lubbock, Texas. He read books about the Civil War, coached the prison softball team, and worked in the prison woodworking shop. He also developed a peculiar habit of drawing eyeballs and decorating his prison cell with them. On August 22, 2020, Charles Albright died at the West Texas Regional Medical Facility in Lubbock at the age of 87. The case remains controversial. Albright was convicted based on hair evidence later proven to be from a dog, and the other murders attributed to him resulted in dropped charges. What is not in dispute is the horror of the crimes. 3 women were killed, their bodies mutilated, and their eyes taken as trophies. The victims' eyeballs were never found. Some speculate that Albright kept them, a grim reminder of his past, in which his mother had forbidden him from using eyes in his taxidermy. Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Peterson, and Shirley Williams were sex workers, women whose deaths were initially overlooked by a society that did not value their lives. The eyeball killer case forced Dallas to confront the reality that their murders mattered and that justice was owed to them, regardless of how they had lived.